former officials who had it in their archives, but nobody was doing research on it. I was probably the second person ever to read the whole study. The first was the guy in charge of the study. And it had a big impact on me. I finished reading it in the summer of '69. I began to copy it to give to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the fall of '69. And they didn't put it out, they for various reasons, but mainly that they would be accused of breaking secrecy. Not a legal problem for them, but the Defense Department, Fulbright thought, would use that as an excuse to take away foreign military aid authorization from Foreign Relations Committee and give it to the Armed Services Committee. So he would lose some of his jurisdiction. And that punishment was enough and he would be criticized for putting it out, which he could have done legally without any question. So he asked Secretary Laird for it. And Laird, by the way, opposed the war very strongly, much as anybody probably, as much as Fulbright. But he did his job. He worked for Nixon. To be sure, Nixon didn't trust him. Nixon was tapping the office and home phones of his military aide personally to make sure that Laird wasn't leaking anything. He never found anything on it. But Laird, anyway, refused to give the study, which would have been in line. The study would have helped his point of view. But he refused to give it to Fulbright without any constitutional basis. He didn't even claim executive privilege. He just said, no, I don't think the national interest would be served by my giving you, on a classified basis, this study, which I had given Fulbright already on an unclassified basis. So Fulbright stayed away from it. Eventually, I gave it to the New York Times. They were enjoined. There was an adventure about that. My wife was involved as we were putting out the papers. My wife is here now. And, but I don't have enough time. Maybe we'll go into that later. Supreme Court said they could print the papers, but I was put on trial facing 12 felony counts, eventually, a possible 115-year sentence, which I expected to get, not the full 115 years. I didn't expect to live that long, or even with good behavior, I would have been getting out in 35 years, which is next year, actually. So some would question whether I would have had good behavior, but who knows. As that came out, and I was under indictment, I met Senator Morse for the first time. I dealt with Fulbright, but not with Morse, who had been, by the way, who had lost his senatorial position in large part because of his opposition to the war, as did Gruning. So the two people who voted against Tonkin Gulf. Morse said to me, having now read the documents in the New York Times, which I had had in my safe in '64, about Tonkin Gulf, and above all, about Tonkin Gulf. He said, if you'd given those to me at the time, and he was on the Foreign Relations Committee, Tonkin Gulf resolution, the undated declaration of war, would never have gotten out of committee. And if they'd brought it to the floor, bypassing the committee, it would never have been passed. So that seemed like a heavy burden for me to have to carry on my shoulders. If I'd done it 7 years before I got it out in the press. Now, if I'd done it, say, 3 or 4 years before I did, who knows, it's a complicated calculation to try to figure out what the effect might have been. But the war would have been on. And one thing I know is, from experience, it wouldn't have stopped the war. And it didn't stop the war in '71 either. The war went on for 4 years. But in '64, he was saying that would have made a difference. My first reaction to that was I didn't accept the full weight of that because I thought, all right, he would have passed up August 7th as the time for the Tonkin Gulf resolution, but another thing would have come along. These events, as McGeorge Bundy put it, are like streetcars. You get another one if you miss one. And he would have used another excuse. He would have lied us into the war later anyway. It took me several years before I was chewing that one over and realized that if I'd given the Congress and the press not just what I had on August 7th, but what I had in September or October, meaning a safe full of documents of planning for the expansion of the war right after the election. That would have stopped the expansion. Johnson, well, nothing's certain, can't say for certain. Maybe it wouldn't have. Maybe Johnson would have gone ahead anyway. I don't think so. There would have been very strong move for impeachment, which would not have succeeded because it was a Democratic Congress, and they would not have impeached him any more than this Republican Congress wanted to impeach Bush. It's not a party thing. They're not going to impeach their leader. He also would have been reelected. But in a country that did not want to widen the war, to discover that all the planning has gone ahead, he had a Congress that did not want to widen the war, and led by Democrats who obeyed the president in public, but privately were telling him all to a man, don't do this. If they had evidence that he was ignoring that and was going ahead anyway, he would have been in deep trouble. I don't think he could have expanded the war, and I'll give just one reason, because it was crazy to do it. The Iraq invasion, had it been fully explained beforehand, not what we know now, but what people inside believed then, which was right. The foresight was quite adequate to stop that war. Iraq was crazy, and the Vietnam escalation was crazy. And people didn't appreciate that as much as it was at the time because they didn't know the inside stuff. They didn't know how much internal criticism and skepticism there was, because that was lied about and concealed, and I didn't tell them. So did I do what I could have done or should have done? Certainly not. It didn't occur to me to do that. Leaking, that would have been against what I'd promised to do. I'd promised to keep the secrets. I just made those promises again. I'd made them 10 times before. It would have undermined the president. I worked for the president. Undermined McNamara. I didn't think he was right on this subject, but I thought he was right on other subjects. Didn't want to undermine him. But such a thought did not occur to me. It's about time that it occurs to more people. Because really 40 years have passed and the same bullshit is going on as we speak. We are being lied. We just know from the National Intelligence Estimate, I won't spend all year, I could spend an hour on that, which I won't do. What is the new National Intelligence Estimate tells us? Not that Iran is a democracy or a wonderful nation. The president says it's a danger in this. No one can prove that he's wrong. In fact, he's a lot on his side. Except that it's quite a different country from the one he's been telling us about for the last several years, because it is not a country that is, as he said, moving full blast ahead for a nuclear capability which they will use diplomatically, a nuclear weapons capability, use and perhaps actually give to terrorists. No, they haven't had such a program. That means it's a different country than we thought. Not a good country necessarily, or totally one that's not dangerous, but it's not the country we thought at that point, or that he's been telling us. Now, what I read today and what I've been hearing more than that is that addresses the question which the Democrats have no more been willing to investigate than the Republicans. What did the president know and when did he know it? First he lied. Let's just say it was misspoke. First he misspoke by saying he had only learned this a week earlier. They say, all right, he learned it back in August. What's coming out now, they had to revise that. What's coming out now that he learned it no later than February and probably October of last year. That's 13 months ago. So for 13 months we've been hearing about a country that is determined to get nuclear weapons in a covert program as fast as possible, and that's our problem. And the president has been told not to rely on that for the last year and has been told for months that it wasn't true. The World War III comment we heard from him was October. The official estimate was August. And the intelligence goes back to the previous October. In short, what I'm saying is the president has reasons that he believes are adequate to attack Iran. Every internal stuff that comes out of there says that the president and Cheney believe we should attack Iran while they're in office. And they have a right to that belief. But it is contested, or his reasons for it have been given to us as false as the notion that we had unequivocal evidence of WMDs, which was a lie, even though I believe that Bush thought they did have WMDs. But the notion that we had unequivocal evidence of it, which of course would have been wrong, was a lie. When Powell said that, it isn't just Bush, when Powell said that, it was a lie. Democratic Senator Durbin says he voted against the authorization back in 2002. He voted against it because he had read the intelligence estimates and had been briefed and understood what the public did not know, that the evidence for WMDs was not what they were saying. It was extremely equivocal, extremely ambiguous, and of course, turned out to be wrong. But at the time, very thin, very controversial, contrary to what the president was saying. He said, so I voted against the authorization. But he said, I couldn't tell my fellow senators, and I couldn't tell the public because it was secret. Now, let's go to Shinseki for one. I'll just close with that notion. Shinseki is used as the example why you can't afford to tell the truth here to the public. Because look what happened to Shinseki when he said,
Lindsay.
pardon me?
And Lawrence Lindsay on the cost estimates.
The name?
I believe it was Lawrence Lindsay who was some senior economic advisor.
Oh, that's another one, yeah,
It
yeah.
wasn't a $40 to $80 billion.
Yeah, right. There were various people. Yeah, he got punished too. And, okay, so Shinseki was asked the question before Congress, how many troops will you need there for the occupation? And he said, well, you'll need more than for the invasion. So it will be several 100,000, is what he said. The same day, Wolfowitz, the number 2 or 3 man in the Defense Department said, that's wildly off the mark. And I remember as somebody who worked for the Defense Department for a dozen years, I thought, I've never seen anything like that. I've never seen a chief of staff batted down in a public statement like that by a civilian official, humiliated like that. And he just said, that's wildly wrong, totally disagree with that. And so forth. The result, many people think Shinseki was fired as a result of that. Actually, he wasn't. What they did do was to announce that he would not be renewed when his term as chief of staff was up the next year, a year later. And that made him, quote, a lame duck. Normally, he would have been renewed and so forth. So now people didn't pay as much attention to him. He's kind of sidelined for the event. And of course, they didn't follow his advice to send several 100,000 men with the effects we've all seen. But I thought at the time, I was struck by 2 things with my new perspective. On the one hand, good for Shinseki to tell the truth as he saw it. Second, second, Shinseki, the chief of staff, did not give that estimate on the top of his head. He probably had studies literally up to his shoulder that would tell Congress, give the lie to Wolfowitz's lie. We now know that both the State Department had studies, a room full of studies, which were ignored by Rumsfeld in the Defense Department, but the Army had tons of studies, of course, as I knew from all the planning work I'd done. Of course, he would tell you why you needed several 100,000, here, there, for this purpose, for that purpose, and so forth. He did not back up that testimony at all. He did not contradict Wolfowitz. I'm not suggesting that the chief of staff should get into a pissing contest, as they say, with the civilian leadership. But he could certainly have encouraged the Congress, and this happens all the time, say, ask me for evidence for my statement. I'm testifying to you. And my aides will bring it in by the wheelbarrow. That's a year before not a year, it's long before the war. Long before the war. He didn't do that. He waited, he was silent for the next year. He didn't say, no, I'm right, here's the thing. He went, he let the war happen. He was borne out. He goes into retirement a year later. I think he did write a memoir. I don't know whether he did. I'm not even sure he did. Other people wrote memoirs, like Richard Clark, who was a Bush man, also a Clinton man, and before that, Father Bush man. in charge of counterterrorism, definitely bipartisan expert here. He writes a memoir in early 2004 bringing out that as chief of counterterrorism in the White House for the government, he understood on September 11th, and 12th that it was Rumsfeld's determination to attack Iraq. 2001. Now that's September 12th, 2001. The attack takes place March 17th, 2003. So that's, what is it, October, November, December, January, February, March, 18 months. 18 months later. He doesn't tell us that until the book comes out in 2004, a year into the war, a little late. He now tells us, and I'm glad he did, it was interesting, history, that when Rumsfeld said he wanted to attack Iraq, he, in the White House, the reason he was there was that he was asked to coordinate the U.S. response to 9/11. Condi said, Dick, you take the chair. Television conference. He's in charge of it. Rumsfeld that day is taking notes to go after Iraq and so forth. On the 12th, the next day, Rumsfeld says wants to attack Iraq. He says, but Iraq had nothing to do with this. This is Osama bin Laden, because he'd been warning about this for months and months and months, most of the year. So he didn't have to do a research on that point. He said, this is what I've been warning you about. This is Osama bin Laden. Rumsfeld says in the memoir, but there are no good targets in Afghanistan. So you have to, I just saw that quote again came out from Wolfowitz, same quote last week. So we're going to attack Iraq. He says to the president, attacking Iraq is like attacking Mexico after Pearl Harbor. But it's a lot worse than that, because Mexico is not the center of 1.5 billion Muslims who feel themselves under attack and who are involved in suicide attacks in various places. As Clark said, this would destroy his counterterrorism program. It would recruit so many people for Osama bin Laden's banner that you would never be able to catch up with them. You could do your best to hold them down, but you could not really reduce them. His program was being destroyed. As intelligence later, after he got out, says, that's what's happened, pretty much. He tells us this in 2004. Well, if he'd come out in 2001 and said this, or 2002, they would have said, as they did say when his memoir came out, oh, he's making that stuff up. He didn't have a conversation with the president on September 12th. The president wasn't in that room on September 12th. That's what Condi Rice said. Then two people who were present at the conversation said, well, actually he was, and we heard this conversation. Cheney said, Clark, he was out of the loop. He was the loop. He ran the loop. Still, that's the kind of thing they would have said. If he had given a drawer full of documents, carefully removing agent names, sources and methods, in communications intelligence that we didn't want to put out, and just his own memos, the planning here that showed this will be a disaster and what the president is saying is totally wrong. I think there's a good chance we would not be where we are in Iraq. Saddam would still be there, probably, doing his murderous bit, and he would still have a tyranny under Saddam. Those who think that the U.S. interests, that we in this country are more secure as a result of our invasion of Iraq, will not criticize Clark, let's say, for helping the president pursue that policy. I have been saying for a couple of years now, since 2002, 5 years, but in particular since 2004, with something we call the Truth-Telling Project. You can see the background on that on my website, ellsberg.net. What we call the Truth-Telling Project, where a dozen people who had had high clearances, CIA, higher than top secret generally, CIA, FBI, NSA people who had retired now, joined me in saying, we regret, those of us who believe we could have put out information earlier that might have saved many American lives and other lives, we regret that we did not do that. And I personally made the point to whatever audience might indirectly reach ears in the Pentagon or the White House or CIA. Don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are falling. Do not wait till the war has started and another thousands of people have died before, if you know that the country is being manipulated with or without an undated declaration of war, but being lied to and manipulated into a disastrous, aggressive war, then accept the personal risks that are involved, and they're large, of telling the truth. Consider it. Consider it. I can't tell anybody what they should do in terms of giving up their own future in the government or hurting their children's education or suffering the other costs that whistleblowers generally do suffer. I didn't. Most marriages do not survive this, actually. Patricia and I have been married for 37 years. Very, very few marriages that went through a long war trial, anti-war trial, actually survived. Right there, you have a very heavy cost. And as I say, I didn't. They didn't put me in prison because the president's crimes against me to keep me quiet during the trial about what I might know about his plans, this is Nixon, were discovered during the trial because of Watergate. And charges were dropped because of government misconduct, and they were a major factor in Nixon's impeachment proceedings, which led to his resignation. So that did have an effect, and I didn't, in the end, pay that big a price. I did, there were certain prices, but nothing like what they had in mind. People called me a martyr. I said, no, I'm no martyr. They had martyrdom in mind for me, but they didn't succeed. And so the price is high, but there's a war's worth of lives at stake. I'll close with this thought. People ask me, aren't I unhappy to see us lied into a war in Iraq after Vietnam? And I say, 35 years later, 2 generations, a whole new set of people, it's not so surprising that people have to learn this for themselves. But I am dismayed and, puzzled and anguished that 5 years after we're lied into Iraq, we could be on the process of being lied into an attack on Iran. Again, which by all accounts, and I'm no expert, but you don't have to be an expert, would be a disaster, another crazy scheme. And when I said I'm going to end, it's on this thought. Despite the national intelligence estimate, I believe those people, mostly Republicans, it so happens. Scott Ritter remains a Republican. Philip Giraldi, the station chief in Turkey, CIA station chief in Turkey. Many people who are sources to Cy Hirsch, that despite the national intelligence estimate having removed the immediate nuclear reason for going into Iran, there is a significant chance. What is that? I'm not talking 1%. There's a, what would we say, 10, 20, 30% chance or more. It's less than it was, but a big chance that this country will attack Iran to disastrous effect in the next year while Bush and Cheney are still in office. And my worries are don't at all have to do with their